All right. What I thought I'd read you this morning is the very beginning of the book. And it's really crucial in a way because the first few pages determine if people are going to read it or not. And secondly, to talk about the Sibling Society, I've got to get my ass in gear and say what it was, what it is. So I'm still working on it, but this is called Chapter 1, The Rise of the Sibling Society. This book does not study men's problems nor women's. It attempts to catch a glimpse of the forces working secretly and below our level of awareness that have created a culture which is adolescent in tone and horizontal in direction. Without any vertical, everyone becomes a half-adult. We have freed ourselves from authority, for better or worse. But when the authority of the father has been gutted and the mother's authority has been removed, then all the citizens in the country behave toward each other as siblings in the family do, with a lot of envy. Quote, mass society with its demand for work without responsibility creates a gigantic army of rival siblings. That's what Alexander Mitscherlich said. The envy is, quote, directed at neighbors and competitors who have more than they. These are the words of Alexander Mitscherlich, who wrote On the Way to the Fatherless Society in 1962. The term sibling society does not imply that this book is literally about siblings, and yet it is among siblings in the family that we see many traits that we now notice in the culture as a whole. Siblings have their own society and often look to each other in a sort of lateral longing for approval that makes the ones above them, the parents, and the ones below them, the smaller children, seem not quite essential. In a sibling society, the mirrors are set, one could say, so that the events happening in the underworld are not reflected, nor the events happening among the stars, nor in the world above the stars. But the mirror shows millions of other siblings like us all over the globe. The generation that's now between 15 and 30 feel the vivid presence of siblings like them in Sweden, Czechoslovakia, Greece, China, France, Brazil, Germany, and Russia. And sometimes the link with the distant siblings through popular music, CDs, videos, and computers seems more vital than the link to family members in the next room. We glimpse the darker side of the sibling society in its betrayal of the young. Childhood, for 300 years in the West, has been imagined as a state that needs protection. The sibling society wants everything revealed. Now children become adults too soon. Talk shows tell everything before the child has learned to trust life or have positive memories, before it has enough equipment to handle all this dark stuff. Neil Postman calls the neglect of children, quote, the disappearance of childhood. A dignified adult life with its heights and depths, protected by wisely kept secrets, once attracted children in such a way that they wanted to become adults. Now they see a garish, brightly lit emptiness, and many children have no interest in becoming adults. Allowing business interests to determine what a child takes in is a fundamental betrayal of the young. The sibling society does not only not protect the young, but it lives with an unacknowledged anger against children. What the young need, stability, presence, attention, advice, good psychic food, unpolluted stories, is exactly what we won't give them. We need to say at the start that this sibling society term is not meant to be true. It's merely a lens through which one can see various tendencies, habits, and griefs that maybe have not come into focus. Kierkegaard once, in trying to predict what the future society would be like, gave this metaphor. People will put up a poster saying, tonight John Eric will skate on thin ice at the very center of the pond. It'll be very dangerous. Please come. Everyone comes, and John Eric skates about 3 inches offshore, and people say, look, he's skating on thin ice at the very center of the pond. A leftist says, on Friday night we'll have a revolution. Come. When Friday night comes, the hall is filled, the radical talks passionately and flamboyantly for an hour and a half, and then declares that a revolution took place here tonight. The audience pours out in the street saying, tonight we had a revolution, tonight we had a revolution. So that's that idea, that the sibling society is a home of the non-event. And I could also mention Academy Awards things. You know any other non-events? But my idea is that in the sibling society, there's a new definition of art. It isn't art that has quality, but the art that is admired is one in which the more people than ever are listening. It all has to take place at the same moment. Authority for the sibling seems an evil thing. We need less government means get my father off my back. During the 19th century, sons knew there was some meat and wine lying on the other side of those oak doors, guarded by the fathers, and open for those who know how to behave themselves. Now sons and daughters may adopt good behavior for another reason, in order to find their way to the breasts of the administrative goddess early. A hatred of authority goes along with a desire for government handouts. During the 50s, U.S. citizens directed their hatred of authority overseas to Russia. As long as Russia agreed to be our hateful brother, we could funnel all adolescent hatred towards Russia. And we did. We targeted a rocket to each Russian city over 100,000 population. Gorbachev said to Reagan, I'm going to do the worst possible thing one man could do to another. I'm going to take away your enemy. He actually said that to Reagan. I'm going to take away your enemy. Now that Russia and her internal and external authorities fallen into ruins, our hatred of authority has to be funneled to something inside our own nation. So this means the heat is increasing. All this hatred that once blown off in steam is just building up now. It's going toward the blacks, it's going toward prisons, it's going towards... Yeah, it is. Those of us who are parents recognize that being parents gives us authority. And we have codes of behavior to teach. We tend to teach our children the codes, but also how to evade the codes. The codes of self-sacrifice, of politeness, of honesty, of truthfulness, of discipline, we teach those. And yet it seems playful and charming to us to find the holes in the codes and step through them. The children in the sibling society primarily learn the holes in the codes rather than the codes themselves. Another thing I notice is that when it's a multicultural thing, you can always find another culture that doesn't have your code, you know. Well, these people aren't polite at the table, so I'm not going to be polite. You know, you can switch around in a multicultural society. And so there are no codes left in a way. There are many children in the sibling society who feel well parented, and there is much adequate parenting. What is new is the deepening rage of the unparented. A man said to me, we've moved away from the two-parent family to the one-parent family, now we're on our way to the zero-parent family. The actual wages of working-class and middle-class parents has fallen significantly since 1972. In many families, both parents are working, sometimes one parent in the day, another at night, so that family meals with the whole family at the table no longer takes place. The time that mothers and fathers spend in conversation with their children is falling in advantaged and disadvantaged families. It's down to about 10 minutes a day for mothers as well as fathers. There's a change in what we want ourselves to be that seems to be coming from inside. The superego can be considered as the internalization of many early parental and educational voices. In the past, an authoritarian superego demanded obedience to parents and insisted on sexual purity, and one could say advocated high morals. Today, the superego remains authoritarian and brutal, but it's changed its insistence. It no longer wants high morals, now it wants its owner to have fame and success. We could say the superego wants everyone to go on talk shows. The very act it would 100 years ago have forbidden is vulgar. These days, as Gilles Lipotevsky said, the superego presents itself under the guise of demands for fame and success, which, if they are not achieved, unleash an implacable storm of criticism against the ego. This affects the creation of art, particularly the slow incubation over years that an artist needs to endure. The superego that once demanded high standards in one's art now demands early success at 20 or 22. Those demands have devastated the art world and damaged the poetry being produced now, whether exhibited in workshops or in poetry slams. Such demands by the superego give the media much more power than they've ever had, and makes their accidental conferring of fame highly destructive. Psychoanalysts were taken by surprise when they realized that through the lives of their younger clients that the superego, which had, so to speak, relaxed so many standards during the Woodstock time on a national level, has in other ways tightened its hold on the individual members, particularly on teenagers. Psychoanalysts describe the superego as terrorist. It's like a terrorist can't be talked out of its demands. People in most cultures, and still in many cultures today, can reason, in quotation marks, with their conscience, talk to it, get a relaxing of admonitions, or quote forgiveness of sins. But the new superego terrorizes. It hijacks a teenager and shoots all potential rescuers. The hangdog look, the druggy, disheartened mood, the lack of grace in body movements, the stammering in speech are not caused by laziness or being spoiled, but by a constant humiliation administered by the new superego. The life of Kurt Cobain we can see as a life sacrificed to that terrorist. If one looks at it so, one understands why so many kids his age committed suicide shortly after his suicide. If even he, famous and successful, can't escape from his tormentor, how can I? Most grown-ups have been slow to see how savage the interior mentor of their own children is. It's more perfectionist than ever, but now there's not enough fame or success in the world to satisfy it. Some parents increase their perfectionism by enrolling children in daycare before they're born. Rather than accepting the child with all his failings, they invest in the child, as in a Wall Street company. The investment is so many hours driving to dance class, so many hours to swimming lessons, so many hours to violin practice, to a karate instructor, plus planning when the child is 5 for which college it'll go to. The superego does this to the parents. Anyway, I say the absence of the father increases the tyrannical quality of the superego. This connection was noticed by Annie Reich and so on, to give the quotations archaic elements in the superego and so on. Alexander Mitscherlich also, who found that many young German men, particularly the fatherless ones, were dealing with an interior judge who wanted them to die. So I've thought sometimes of calling this interior judge rather than superego.
Yeah.
Do you prefer that?
Yeah.
Why should this happen to the interior judge? One possibility, as vertical attention disappears, the interior judge no longer uses St. Francis or George Washington or St. Teresa to find its bearings, but instead shifts to Barbara Streisand or Michael Jackson or a TV anchor. If you fail to become successful and well-loved, the punishment is swift and thorough. Your self-esteem receives a battering from inside. You feel like nothing until in desperation you finally agree to run a talk show and tell everything. Once that moment is over and you discover that universal love has not poured onto your head following the program, you fall still farther into despair.
Wow.
This longing for perfection in ourselves, present or hoped for, quote, is perfectly compatible with indifference toward others. I like that. This longing for perfection in ourselves is perfectly compatible with indifference toward others. I know that from personal experience. Why should the superego or the interior judge in this permissive, easygoing society become so brutal and terroristic? One possibility is that the business community, through advertising, which hits children beginning about the age of 2 onward, so inflames the greedy, desirous part of the soul, that pure intestine stuff, that the interior judge has to blow himself up in order to meet or combat this inflamed wanting. If your greed gets bigger, then the opposition inside of you has got to get bigger. Dangerous impulses from inside seem more terrifying now. People flee from feeling to avoid terrifying desires. The interior judge or superego can no longer rely on outward authority in its battle against impulse. It used to be backed up by the superintendent and everybody, and he has to do it alone. And so he naturally moves toward a primitive, humorless savagery. The idea that the superego has changed the demands from requiring us to be good, requiring us to be famous, makes sober reading. The possibility that the superego would change is something Freud never imagined. If the interior judge has changed, it means that consumer capitalism's dependence on stimulating greed and desires has actually changed something fundamental inside the human being. And this superego has found itself unable to stand up against the greediness, now virtually installed as the American way, and shifted its current emphasis to success and fame. The image we need to take away from this scene is the strange picture of the superego itself being battered. It was once the batterer and the ally of the rigid father, and now it feels itself overpowered and beaten up, basically by the archaic desire systems. When the history of 1970 to 2010 is written, it will not be a history of scientific discoveries, great paintings, great literature, or great inventions. It will be a history of fantasy. Fantasy promises that we can avoid paying for our limitations. Falstaff says, we owe God a death. But the Sibling Society, we don't accept limitations, and we don't pay our debts to ancestors, God, or nature. Virtual reality, touted as an alternative reality, really means no reality at all. Virtual reality means that the neocortex, outflanked on all sides by the horses, creates a place where it can be in control for 40 minutes, while the lower brains run everything else in the universe. The extended adolescence of the Sibling Society breeds childlike or primitive fantasies, which well up inside ordinary people. A teenager moves out of childhood toward adolescence, but finding nothing fruitful or sturdy there, turns around, retreats, or drifts back to an earlier psychic country, where he can overcome the pain of being lost, but at a high cost. The cost is that he or she becomes burdened with isolating, inflationary, demeaning, obsessive fantasies. Fantasy in the past was usually associated with overleaping obstacles, transcending death, making everything come out all right, with themes that Walt Disney liked. Now it's as if death comes along and attaches itself to the isolated teenagers. There's much death energy in sibling fantasies. The devotion to fantasy alone in your room is itself an expression of death energy, which the teenager is fighting ineffectively. The third sort of fantasy characteristic of sibling culture does not involve a return to one's own childhood, but rather a return to the childhood of the race. Fantasies appear from areas of the soul long thought to have been superseded. One example is the fantasy that present time, quote, is profoundly degraded and full of evil, and, quote, can only be cleansed through blood. This is an old fantasy connected with the ritual killing of a scapegoat, probably with human sacrifice. Such fantasies come forward in our culture and are given permission to become reality now. The Journal of Psychohistory tries to keep track of some of our archaic fantasies as they drift upward into political cartoons, obsessive writing, and violent acts. Many Americans entertain the fantasy that a woman with power is a witch and must be killed. The idea rises from a very old level of the brain, but Hillary Clinton knows how present it can be in our time. Some entertain the fantasy there's an evil person or evil group somewhere, and in order for us to return to normal, that group must be wiped out. Well, they're in the prison system now. The paternal society, with its premium on nationhood, gave permission for us to imagine Russia as an evil empire, and the cost of that was the economic wealth of the entire United States. But the sibling society is an inward collapsing structure, and now the hateful group becomes the U.S. government. It'd be foolish to imagine that the computer mentality can save us from such fantasies. People learn on the internet how to make a bomb. I've got one paragraph left. We notice that a fourth archaic fantasy is also operating, namely the idea that sacrifice of children will somehow bring us back to health, even to wealth. One's words falter as soon as the tongue has expressed such an idea. The congressional assault on support for children, the national giving of children's mentality over to television, almost Aztec in its thoroughness, suggests that despite all our rationality, a deep-lying and archaic fantasy is taking hold. Namely, if we sacrifice our children, we may become healthy and sound again. So that's where that ends. So that was good. What I want to do now is to read you part of the last chapter, which is, there's sections, there's an attack on the left wing in the book, which is called Teaching Children That Nothing Works. There's an attack on the right wing for, after 2,000 years, really allowing capitalism to have its own way without any restriction from church or anything. And so on. There's a lot of ground covered here. And so in the end, I have to do something like, what can we do? I'd rather not do this at all. I'd rather simply say, I'm a doctor and it's a broken leg. I'm a diagnostician. I don't say how to repair the leg, but it's not quite satisfying. So I'm going to make a stab at it. Some people say I have painted too dark a picture in this book of the Sibling Society. I can understand that opinion, and I share it to some extent. The Sibling Society is only 1/3 or 1/2 developed, perhaps. We don't know what changes may happen in the future. I believe that no culture has ever gone this far into fatherlessness and virtual reality. So some attempt at description of the sibling culture, even in the unfinished state, is worth trying. I think we could say that an earlier draft of this book, perhaps even a superior version of this book, can be found in Jose Ortega y Gasset's Revolt of the Masses, published in 1930. He makes clear in the book that by the word masses he does not mean the working class, but the heirs of technology. I have been guided in writing this book by his wonderful sentence, "If you prefer not to exaggerate, you may as well remain silent." He notices that we typically cover over terrible reality with a curtain of fantasy made up of ideas that defend our comfort, and here's a quotation from him. "The man with a clear head is a man who frees himself from these fantastic ideas and looks life in the face, realizes that everything in it is problematic, and feels himself lost. As this is a simple truth, that to live is to feel oneself lost, he who accepts it has already begun to find himself, to be on firm ground. Instinctively, as do the shipwrecked, he'll look around for something to which to cling, and that tragic, ruthless glance, absolutely sincere, because it's a question of his salvation, will cause him to bring order into the chaos of his life. These are the only genuine ideas, the ideas of the shipwrecked. All the rest is rhetoric, posturing, and farce. He who does not really feel himself lost is lost without remission." Well, and I think what shipwrecked people feel most is a lot of grief. Some of them have seen a ship go down with their friends in it. Simply walking up and down the shore without any clothes or food and looking out over the ocean is a situation in which grief is appropriate. That's really where we are. We can get the figures from each other about the percentage of young black men in prison, the number of illiterates turned out each year in school, the numbers of depressed people who need extensive psychological help, doubling every 10 years, the numbers of homeless mad wandering the streets, and the fatherless daughters and sons, and the betrayal of their home countries by transnational corporations. Any one of these continuing events is enough for a lifetime of grief. For healing, then, we don't need fights about statistics, but a national day or month or year of grieving. Michael Ventura, in his great essay called The Age of Endarkenment, talks about our need to turn and face the adolescence we now have in the sibling culture. He says, "For tens of thousands of years, tribal people everywhere have greeted the onset of puberty, especially in males, with elaborate and excruciating initiations. A practice that plainly wouldn't have been necessary unless their young were as extreme as ours. This is terribly important. It means that when conservatives talk of rock culture subverting the young, when others talk about that same culture liberating the young, or when postmodern technologists talk of our electronic environment rewiring the software of new generations, they're all making the same mistake. They fail to understand that a psychic structure that has remained constant for 100,000 years is not likely to be altered in a generation by stimuli that play upon its surfaces. What's really going on is very different. The same raw ancient content is surging through youth psyches, but adult culture over the last few centuries has forgotten how to meet, guide, and be replenished by its force. For about 40 years now, the young have generated forms, music, fashions, behaviors that prolong the initiatory moment. In other words, it's a demand for initiation. This very extension of the initiatory moment is helping to drive everyone mad because they never get a response. Unlike us, tribal people meet the extremism of their young, and I'm using extremism as a catch-all word for the intense psychic cacophony of adolescence, with an equal but focused extremism from adults. Tribal adults didn't run from this moment. They celebrated it. The crucial word here is focus. The adults had something to teach: stories, skills, magic, dances, visions, rituals. In fact, if these things were not learned well, the tribe could not survive. But the adults did not splatter all this material all over the young from the time of their birth as we do. They focused and were as selective as possible about what they taught and told and when. They waited till their children reached the intensity of adolescence, and then they used the very intensity's capacity for absorption, its hunger, its need to act out, its craving for dark things, dark knowledge, dark acts, all the qualities we fear most in our kids. Ancients used these very qualities as teaching tools. So that's a good passage by Ventura. The implications of Ventura's remarks and those of other observers such as Alan McGlashan is that we don't have the luxury of ignoring the young men. For a long time we could feel superior to the so-called traditional cultures or primitive cultures who work so hard to bring their testosterone-crazed young men into the community fold. But looking at the ruins of the patriarchal culture scattered all around us, we see that whatever worked in the past is not working now. Millions of adolescents are coming out of school without ever being introduced to their own souls. We've been talking about projects we need to undertake, or projects of fathering, mentoring, ordaining adolescents into sub-adulthood, helping young parents learn parenting. All of these things we need to do, but there are many things we need to rethink as well. For a long time, Marion Woodman has challenged both men and women to make clear distinctions between patriarchy and masculinity. The ideals of patriarchy, hardness of soul, holding emotions in, sacrificing oneself for business or war, damage all women, we could say, but it also damages 94% of men. The work that the ideologues have not done is to identify the positive side of masculinity and distinguish that from the brutal side. Another work has to be done to distinguish matriarchy from the feminine. We need to distinguish also the collective father from the personal father, and both from the father we long for. That's the father we long for is capitalized. Amen. The departure of Americans from Europe really drained a lot of energy out of the collective father. No matter how ferocious the Sicilian father or the Armenian father may have been in immigrant families, the air began to drain out of him, and in a few generations he was reduced virtually to the status of the ordinary father we see in Dagwood and Blondie. In a sense, we allow both the collective father and the personal father to shrink. It's a mirror image of the German situation. As the air goes out of the collective father, the personal father begins to shrink also. When the collective father shrinks to normal size, the personal father shrinks to a dot. Young men all over the country mutter, I don't even know who he was. I don't know what his political opinions. He never told me. I don't know if he believes in God or not. One can glimpse a vast continuum from the physical father to the collective father, then to the archetypal father, such as the Pope, and finally beyond that to a father we have no name for. And then I just put in parentheses, we know that far out in the universe as well, there's a mother we have no name for. But far out in the universe, there's a father we have no name for who asks for disciplines and urges civilization on. I'm really thinking this is true. One reason men love the father is that far out there, the kernel of civilization as if comes down from that father. If we confuse one father with another, then in our disappointment with our personal father, or with the collective father, or with the Pope, we throw away all knowledge of the invisible, elegant father. If it's correct to say that when the collective father in the United States shrinks, and we felt it during the Vietnam War, then the personal father shrinks to a dot, and the great father or the Pope loses much of our affection. When the administration pursues a war as stupid and destructive as the Vietnam War, then the fathers in the religious world are diminished, whether we like it or not, in the eyes of our soul. But all three fathers seem, when we look at them now, to be bags of empty air. Then the furthest father, the one the Norwegians called the seventh father of the house. There's a great one. The guy comes to traveler. Can I, a guy about 30 years old answers, can I sleep in your house tonight? Yeah, I can, but I'll have to ask my father. Then you go and the next one's about 80. Then the next one's about 120. And you look over by the fireplace, there's a little guy. I'm sorry, I'm a traveler traveling through the country. I don't have a place to sleep. Could I sleep in your house tonight? It's okay with me, but you have to ask my father. And you look over and there's a tiny guy sitting on a stool about that big. He goes over and bends into his head. I'm traveling through the country. Could I stay at your house tonight? It's all right with me, but you have to ask my father. And that's the sixth one. And then you glance up at the wall, and there's a hunting horn lying up there, hanging on the wall. And he goes in, and a tiny little man about that long, with a long white beard lying there. Excuse me, I'm traveling through the countryside. Could I sleep in your house tonight? Yes. So, we need to repeat once more that we're not suggesting that our culture go back to the patriarchal model. That's over. There's no possibility of establishing the power of the collective father again. Like everyone else, I long for order and harmony in my own life as in the life around me. But we can only find that by going forward. In this book, I'm like a doctor who says you have a broken leg. The issue is not nostalgia for the former whole leg, because the more we examine the leg, we more see that it was broken sometime earlier as well. Many people have remarked that the death of the paternal society began the moment the French Revolution was born. With the fathers gone, functioning patriarchy is over. Someone shot it in the head as an act of mercy during the last 2 decades. The power of the transnational corporations, sadly, fit into the sibling society better than they fit into the paternal society. That's a very sad fact. When we think, however, soberly of what our children will experience in the coming years, we have to decide how much of our Western culture we want to preserve. We know that at one time in the 60s, there were only 2 colleges left in the United States that required a foreign language for graduation. Some foreign language requirements have been restored, but a lot of our common culture is being thrown out the window. People who watch such things are amazed at how eagerly male and female professors in colleges and even members of school boards in small towns are willing to throw out so much of our past literature, a literature which we might call the common story. The reason given for tossing literature overboard is that we need to encourage multiculturalism, which is certainly a valid and valuable intent. But I think the real reason is that we're having a nervous breakdown. No nation has ever experienced a look at its own past to the depth that we have now. We see how much cruelty it takes to make a so-called great nation. Documentaries detail the corruption of the American Republic in its exception, in its treatment of Native Americans, in its treatment of black people, its treatment of white people, all the scandals with which it's presently involved. We used to look in the eyes of our mothers and fathers, and their eyes sometimes said that we were worthy. Now we look into the eyes of television, and the eyes reply we're unworthy. Our unworthiness is supported every day by new revelations. Children see in our history the criminal acquiescence of their grandparents at best, or the criminal activity of their grandparents at worst. The truth about our own past is giving us a nervous breakdown. If we're in one of the first cultures in the history of the world that's ever been presented with the truth of its own past, then why shouldn't we throw everything out the window? We are as inexperienced in guilt as the Mandan Indians were in smallpox. We could say that one blanket infected with guilt and passed among us will result in 1,000 deaths by guilt in the next week. Many cultures before us founded their nation by killing all the sheep, cattle, men and women and children in any town that their particular Moses pointed to. But the collective fathers were careful to wrap those admissions in resonant tones and pious certainties. All that's evaporated. We're now being faced with the truth of how a nation becomes a nation. It's said that this planet is a hard place to live. There is scarcity of food, extremes of heat and cold, abundant viruses. Some people even believe that many events on this planet are guided by certain archons that are evil by nature. But we, being horizontal, have given up blaming the archons or even the gods of destiny, and now we're blaming ourselves. Probably that's right, but if we recognize that we are some of the first that have experienced the way humans create a powerful nation, we shouldn't wonder why many citizens encourage us to throw away all literature created by men and women who were alive at the time those ugly events occurred. I'm against the demolishing of the common story, that is, throwing the Iliad and the epics of Charlemagne and the opinions of Samuel Johnson and the poems of Robert Frost out the window. We have to notice that when an individual human being has a nervous breakdown, we don't treat him or her by throwing away all the personal possessions. If a man or woman discovers midway in life that his or her parents were more corrupt than originally thought, psychologists have learned that such a person needs not to hold on to a certain core if genuine change is to take place. No one suggests that such people should throw away all the songs they sang in high school, or blot out all memories of their friends or childhood, or renounce in the same moment their family, their country, their state, their nationality, their race. Every psychologist knows that it'd be madness. Growth can only proceed if the person honors that part of the soul that's turned toward the goodness, so to speak, of their ancestors, so that they know there's something essentially worthy in them, for whose sake they go through all this agony. Why would we want to treat our nation with its shocking past so differently from the way we've learned to treat ourselves? As the sibling society goes on, we need to learn to cool down and preserve in our culture what we would like to see preserved in our own lives. So this is about halfway through this chapter, and we don't have any more. I'm talking about transnational corporations and fighting them and a whole bunch of stuff in the later part. But it's only a first draft, so I'm